Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we try to sift through all the noise, get straight to the point, and really give you those key bits of knowledge that help make sense of some pretty complex stuff. And today, wow, we are diving headfirst into a question that's echoed down through the history, sparked, countless debates, and honestly, it still feels incredibly relevant right now.
Yeah.
Was Jesus political?
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. And this isn't just some, dusty academic thing or a purely theological argument tucked away in old books. It feels profoundly polarizing, actually, and surprisingly current. It has huge implications.
Absolutely.
Think about it. How you understand Jesus's role, it doesn't just shape your grasp of history or theology. It filters into how we view leadership today, social justice, activism, even how change happens in our own time.
It really challenges our assumptions.
Totally. About what it even means to create change. And it's definitely not a simple yes or no answer, is it?
Not at all. Far from it.
So to help guide us through this really rich, and let's be honest, often contentious area, we've actually got access to some amazing source material. We have excerpts from a great debate series, pretty high profile, that brought together a leading historian and a very highly respected pastor.
And what's so compelling is how these two, brilliant minds, they have these deeply held, really well-reasoned arguments. But they also look at the exact same events, the same teachings of Jesus, and they come to conclusions that seem, well, on the surface, completely different, wildly divergent even.
Right. It's fascinating. So our mission today, take you on a deep dive into these sources. We're going to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from this really high-level exchange. We'll unpack the surprising facts, maybe some nuances that emerge from their discussion, and hopefully help you understand it all without feeling, totally overwhelmed.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's get into it.
So what's genuinely fascinating here, right from the get-go, is how fundamentally different the starting points are for each of these debaters. Their frameworks, their whole approach, it's deeply rooted in their disciplines. They're looking at the historical figure of Jesus through two really distinct lenses, and that shapes everything.
Two different ways of seeing.
Exactly. So on one side, we've got Dr. Margaret Leland. She's a pretty renowned professor of ancient Near Eastern history, wrote a very influential book called The Nazarene and the Empire. Her perspective is, as you'd expect, rigorously historical. She's zeroed in on the socio-political realities of Jesus' time, trying to understand him in that context, the day-to-day reality of Roman occupation, which was harsh. Yeah. Then on the other side, there's Reverend Paul Matthews, senior pastor, author of The Kingdom Not of This World. And Reverend Matthews comes at it from a deeply theological, pastoral angle, his focus, spiritual transformation, the timeless, universal aspects of Jesus' message.
Okay, so historian versus pastor.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And Dr. Leland kicks off her argument with a very clear, very assertive stance. She says Jesus was political, unequivocally. And she argues that denying this actually strips his message of its original radical force. It makes us miss the profound implications.
Okay, strong start.
Very. Now, Reverend Matthews, he acknowledges, of course, Jesus lived within a political context. That's just history, right?
Yeah.
It's undeniable. But he respectfully disagrees that Jesus himself was political in nature. For him, the primary mission was fundamentally spiritual. It was about transforming hearts, not, overthrowing earthly governments or playing power politics.
The context versus core mission.
Precisely. And that fundamental disagreement, right there in the opening statements, it just sets the stage for a really illuminating and, frankly, a vital discussion.
Yeah, you can feel the tension immediately. It's a really compelling start. And the very first thing they grapple with, it isn't just what Jesus did or said, it's how we even define that word political, especially in that ancient context.
Right, because the definition shapes the whole argument.
Totally. It's crucial. So let's unpack Dr. Leland's view first. As the historian, her core argument is, well, it's robust. She says he was indeed political, and she feels strongly that denying this, well, like you said, it strips his message of its original radical force. She paints this really vivid and honestly quite stark picture of the world Jesus actually lived in. This wasn't some, abstract theological bubble he was floating in.
No, not at all.
He lived under Roman occupation. And that was a brutal, oppressive reality. You have to think about the daily experience. Imperial rule wasn't just some concept.
Right. It was violence.
Exactly. Overt violence, the constant threat of soldiers, crippling taxation. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It hit the poor, the marginalized, the hardest, pushing them deeper into poverty, sometimes debt slavery.
It was the air they breathed.
It really was the fabric of society. And Dr. Leland really emphasizes that Jesus' teachings, they weren't solely focused on individual sin or, personal piety in a vacuum. She argues he directly addressed systems of oppression. He confronted the powerful, not just like advising private citizens on morals.
So challenging the structures themselves.
Yes, challenging the authority of the temple elites. And in her view, these elites were often seen, certainly by the common people, as colluding with the Romans.
Mm-hmm. Keeping the peace for Rome, basically.
Right. They often benefited from the system, kept their religious authority and wealth in exchange for maintaining order and helping collect taxes for Rome. And that created huge resentment. People saw their leaders as compromised.
Makes sense.
So Dr. Leland points specifically to that famous incident, Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. She argues this wasn't just, a random outburst of anger.
Not just losing his temper.
No. It was a public, very tangible, highly symbolic protest against that perceived corruption, that complicity. It directly challenged the economic and religious establishment that was tangled up with Roman authority.
A political act, in her view.
Definitely. And for her, when Jesus talked about and called for a new order, what he called the kingdom of God, that was far from some vague spiritual metaphor.
Okay.
In her words, it was a direct confrontation with the ruling structures of his time. Think about it. To a Jewish audience suffering under foreign rule, the idea of God's kingdom. That meant divine rule, restoring Israel, liberation from oppression.
It would have sounded radical.
Hugely radical. A transformative vision that inherently carried political weight, whether he meant a military takeover or a spiritual transformation of society. So if you just hear that sigh, well, you might understandably think, how could he not be political?
And that's exactly the point where Reverend Matthew steps in. He offers an equally compelling case, but through a really different lens. He doesn't dispute the history, right? He accepts Jesus lived in a political context. That's just fact.
Yeah.
Acknowledges the Roman occupation, the harsh realities.
Okay.
But then he makes this crucial distinction. He respectfully disagrees that Jesus himself was political in nature or that his mission was primarily political.
The emphasis is on primarily.
Exactly. For Reverend Matthews, Jesus' mission was fundamentally spiritual. It was designed to operate on a completely different level. He argues pretty forcefully that Jesus came to transform hearts, and his ultimate goal was spiritual liberation, not political rebellion.
Internal versus external.
That's the core of it. The focus is on an internal personal revolution within individuals, rather than an external governmental change. Reverend Matthews constantly brings up Jesus' message about establishing a kingdom that is not of this world. This isn't the kingdom you find on a map,
No.
No borders, no armies, no conventional political power. It's a spiritual realm, operating on principles like love, peace, justice, spreading through voluntary change, not force.
So not imposed from the top down.
Precisely. And he points out that Jesus actively avoided political entanglements, which is significant because first century Judea was, it was a hotbed of different political groups.
Yeah, the Zealots, the Sadducees.
Exactly. You had the Zealots pushing for violent revolt against Rome, the Sadducees who collaborated, the Pharisees focused on religious law. Matthews notes Jesus refused to align with any of them.
He didn't pick a side.
Right. Specifically refused to side with Zealots or revolutionaries, even though they were popular with some crowds. His aim, the pastor insists, was ultimately spiritual liberation, not political rebellion.
Okay.
So this immediately raises a really important question for us, for you listening. Can a message be profoundly spiritual, aiming for that interchange, but still end up having undeniable political consequences, even if that wasn't the main goal?
That's a great question. The unintended consequences, maybe?
Or maybe intended consequences, just not conventionally political ones. That tension between the spiritual intent and the political impact, that's really the core issue they're grappling with right from the start.
Yeah, that tension is palpable. And it
Mhm.
really forces you to think about how spiritual change actually interacts with the world, doesn't it? The ripple effects.
Exactly.
And what's so striking as the debate unfolds is how both Dr. Leland and Reverend Matthews look at the exact same events from Jesus' life, the same historical records, but they interpret them through completely different lenses to back up their points.
Right. It's like they're looking at the same chessboard but seeing totally different games.
It really is. Like watching two master strategists with the same map, but seeing different destinations. Let's dig into Dr. Leland's historical material view of these events a bit more. She really grounds Jesus's actions in those harsh realities of Roman occupation. She talks about his frequent mentions of the poor and the oppressed, and she argues these weren't just, abstract theological ideas.
Not just symbolic language?
No, they were, in her words, grounded in real material conditions under Rome. She points to the crushing weight of Roman taxes, often collected by corrupt local officials that pushed so many people into debt off their land.
Creating that very real poverty and oppression he spoke about.
Precisely. So she sees Jesus's identification with them, his advocacy for them, as an inherently political act in a system designed to keep them down. And she comes back to overturning the tables in the temple. Again, for her, not just a random outburst, but a deliberate protest against corruption and collusion with Roman powers. It wasn't just about money changers making a profit. It was a powerful public challenge to the whole economic and religious system that propped up and benefited from Roman rule. A symbolic act of defiance.
Disrupting the status quo.
Exactly. And then there's that title, King of the Jews. Dr. Leland really stresses this was deeply political. It wasn't just a religious claim.
How so?
Well, in that context, it was a direct challenge to Rome's power. Rome only recognized Caesar as king, or rulers they appointed. Anyone else claiming kingship in a Roman province, that was a rebellion, by definition.
Automatically treasonous, essentially.
Pretty much. And she points to the crucifixion itself as maybe the most undeniable piece of evidence. She reminds us crucifixion was this gruesome, very public punishment reserved for political threats by the Romans.
Right. It wasn't the standard Jewish punishment for, say, blasphemy.
No, not at all. That would be stoning under Jewish law. Crucifixion was Rome's tool for deterring insurrection, for making an example of anyone who challenged their authority or claimed kingship. The cross itself was Rome's ultimate political statement.
And that point about crucifixion, it just carries immense weight, doesn't it? If you connect that to the bigger picture, it seems, well, undeniable that Rome saw him as a political threat. Whatever his own intentions or spiritual goals were, that's how the authorities perceived him.
Yeah, they weren't debating theology.
No. They saw a guy attracting huge crowds, fervent crowds, being called king, even if it was meant metaphorically by some, and challenging the existing powers, whether religious elites or implicitly Roman rule itself.
That was enough.
That was enough. Enough to label him a political agitator. Crucifixion wasn't just an execution. It was a brutal public message from the empire. Don't mess with us. This is what happens. So it's really hard to argue that the reason and the method of his death weren't loaded with political meaning, even if his life's primary aim was spiritual.
Absolutely. The shadow of the cross looms large politically. But then Reverend Matthews steps in with his spiritual transcendent interpretation, offering this powerful counter-narrative to those very same events. He doesn't deny the historical facts the crucifixion happened, the title was used, but he reinterprets their meaning. He places them within a divine framework, not just an earthly one.
Okay, how does he do that?
Well, take Jesus' words about the poor and condemning exploitation. Matthews acknowledges them, but insists they were spoken in moral, not militant terms. Jesus' compassion was about ethics, about personal kindness, mercy, a call for a change of heart in individuals, not about organizing some kind of political revolution.
So focusing on individual morality, not collective action.
Right. And then there's that incredibly famous, always debated line, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's.
Ah, yes, that one.
Matthews presents this as a key moment where Jesus explicitly disentangled faith from politics. He sees it as Jesus refusing to get dragged into worldly power fights, instead directing ultimate loyalty towards a different authority god. For Matthews, this isn't a call to political action. It's about setting spiritual priorities straight.
Separating the realms in a way.
That's his interpretation. And he also brings up the story of Jesus healing the Roman centurion's servant. Remember that one?
The Roman officer.
Yeah. Matthews emphasizes that Jesus praised his faith. And by healing the servant of a Roman officer, someone seen as an oppressor by many Jews, he transcended tribal and political divisions.
Showing compassion beyond boundaries.
Exactly. For the pastor, actions like that powerfully show a spiritual agenda that rises above earthly conflicts and nationalism.
Okay.
But Dr. Leland, the historian, she's not letting go of that render unto Caesar line quite so easily. She pushes back hard on Matthew's interpretation. She argues it's way more nuanced, maybe even subversive, than just a simple separation of church and state, so to speak.
Subversive how?
She describes it as a masterstroke of political resistance disguised as neutrality. She suggests Jesus wasn't just saying, okay, pay your taxes, move along. Instead, she thinks he was subtly pushing people, challenging them to really think, to question, What truly belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God?
Ah, okay, so implying limits to Caesar's authority.
Exactly. Subtly asserting God's sovereignty over everything, including the things Rome thought it controlled. It's a question that forces you to consider where imperial power ends and divine authority begins. It's unsettling.
That's a very different reading. And Reverend Matthews, how does he respond to that? He basically doubles down on his view. For him, it was simply Jesus disentangling faith from politics, refusing to let Caesar define spiritual duty. He argues Jesus was drawing a clear line. Your ultimate allegiance, your spiritual obligations, those belong only to God. Mundane civic stuff like taxes, secondary. Doesn't define your spiritual life or loyalty.
So not a political game, but a fundamental truth about ultimate authority.
That's his take. And this back and forth over render unto Caesar, it just perfectly illustrates the ambiguity, doesn't it, of such a pivotal phrase.
Yeah.
Which brings up that crucial question for us, for you listening. How much of our interpretation of these ancient texts, especially the really debated ones, comes from the context we bring? Our modern ideas, our assumptions.
Versus what the words might have meant then.
Exactly. How much is our lens shaping what we see? The same words can be read in profoundly different ways, both seeming valid within their own frameworks.
That is a profound point, and it's actually a perfect lead-in to the next part of the debate, the actual language Jesus used. So moving beyond his actions, what about the specific words?
The vocabulary itself.
Yeah, was it like subtly coded with hidden political meanings? Or was it purely spiritual in intent and how it landed?
Another layer to peel back.
Definitely. Dr. Leland makes a really strong case for what she calls charged language. She argues that terms like kingdom, Messiah, Son of Man, these weren't just, empty religious platitudes in first century Judea. She insists they were charged with profound political implications. You absolutely have to remember the context, the intense longing of the Jewish people for liberation from Rome.
The air was thick with expectation.
Totally. So in that atmosphere, these specific words carried enormous historical and cultural weight. She reminds us that Messiah in particular signified an anointed leader who would liberate Israel.
A figure with political, nationalistic, even military dimensions.
Right. Someone who would restore Jewish sovereignty, bring in a new age. It wasn't just about spiritual deliverance in our modern sense. It was often expected to be a kingly figure, a liberator in a very real-world way.
Okay.
She also points to Jesus's parables, the ones that often feature these radical power reversals, stories where the last shall be first, the exalted brought low.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Leland doesn't see these as just simple moral lessons. She views them as revolutionary language that directly challenged the existing social hierarchy, the power structures of the time.
Mm-hmm.
These weren't just abstract lessons in humility. They were like pronouncements about a world turned upside down, where the powerful fall and the powerless rise.
Challenging the very foundations of the current order.
Exactly. So her conclusion is that even if Jesus personally refused earthly kingship in the conventional way, his teachings, his language, his sheer presence directly threatened the existing power order. And this, she argues, is why both religious and political leaders sought his death. They understood the threat. They saw how his message, regardless of its spiritual intent, undermined their authority and the stability Rome demanded.
It's a compelling argument when you place the language back in that specific volatile context.
Yeah.
But of course, Reverend Matthews offers a counterinterpretation. He focuses on what he terms an inward revolution.
Okay, inward revolution.
Yeah. He agrees Jesus spoke of revolution, but for him it was happening inward, inside the human spirit. The transformation Jesus was after. It was in the heart, not in the palace. He highlights the Beatitudes as key evidence. Jesus chose to bless the meek, not the militant, which is a stark contrast, right, to the revolutionary zeal and violence some other groups were advocating for at the time.
Yeah, blessing the peacemakers, those who mourn. It's not exactly a call to arms.
Not at all. It's profoundly countercultural in that context, focusing on humility, peacemaking, even suffering for righteousness' sake.
Okay, what else?
He also points to how Jesus described the kingdom of God growing. Remember the parable of the mustard seed?
Mm-hmm. Starts tiny, grows huge.
Right. Grows quietly, organically, not through force, not through political maneuvering. The imagery suggests this kind of invisible, non-coercive spread of influence. Totally different from political movements that rely on, power grabs, demonstrations, armies.
A different kind of growth model.
Completely different.
Yeah.
And crucially, Matthews reminds us that Jesus explicitly refused to become king when offered. Remember, after feeding the 5,000, the crowds wanted to make him king.
Yeah, and he slipped away.
Exactly. He presents this as the opposite of political ambition. Jesus actively withdrew from that popular push for earthly rule. He demonstrated his rejection of worldly power.
So avoiding the political trap.
That's how Matthew sees it. He concludes that while, yes, leaders definitely feared Jesus' influence, saw him as a disruptor, he was not because he incited rebellion. He argues Jesus spoke of love, humility, and grace, not insurrection.
Wow. So the same language interpreted through these two lenses leads to such different places.
It really does. And this tension, right, between a message aimed at internal transformation and its undeniable external impact, that's truly at the heart of this whole deep dive. Was the threat Jesus posed primarily spiritual, but just happened to have political fallout? Or was it inherently political from the start, maybe in a more subtle, subversive way than overt rebellion? It forces us to really define what kind of power we're even talking about, earthly or divine.
That distinction is absolutely critical, isn't it? Internal versus external revolution. And it raises fascinating questions about how change actually happens in the world. Okay, let's maybe zoom out a bit now. Let's consider the deeper implications of each perspective, particularly through, say, ethical lenses and then maybe broader academic views. How does each viewpoint shape how we understand Jesus' moral legacy? And maybe more importantly for us listening, why should that matter today as we try to figure out our own roles in society?
Right, connecting it to the so what for us now.
Exactly. So for Dr. Leland, the historian, seeing Jesus as political is vital for his ethical legacy. It's not just an academic point for her. She sees him not just as a spiritual guide, but as a direct advocate for the marginalized, a powerful voice for justice.
Okay. And how does that empower people today?
Well, she argues this understanding empowers modern believers to confront injustice today, not just spiritually, but materially. She points to examples like figures in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., for instance.
Who drew heavily on Jesus' teachings.
Absolutely. They saw Jesus as a revolutionary figure for social change, inspiring them to challenge systemic oppression. For Dr. Leland, if you ignore this political dimension, if you reduce Jesus only to spiritual teachings, you essentially neuter his message.
You take the teeth out of it.
That's her point. You strip it of its power to motivate action against real-world suffering, against systemic wrongs, against entrenched power. A non-political Jesus, for her, isn't challenging enough.
Okay, that's a strong ethical claim. What's Reverend Matthews' counter on the ethical front? Well, he offers a very powerful counterargument. He asserts that actually it's precisely the spiritual core of the message that gives Jesus' teachings their timeless power and their universal ethical weight.
How so?
He argues that Jesus' radical call to things like love enemies and forgive endlessly, that's what truly challenges both individuals and societies on a fundamental level. For him, the real ethical impact doesn't come from direct political action, but from that fundamental change within individual hearts, that personal transformation that can ripple outward.
So changing people first, and that changes society eventually.
That's the idea. He'd argue, look, it wasn't about leading armies or writing laws. It was about this deep internal moral compass that then affects how people treat each other, how they build community. And over time, yeah, that subtly shapes the wider culture. Think about the sheer power of genuine forgiveness or reconciliation sometimes that can break cycles of violence in ways laws just can't touch.
And this is where the source material shows them really going back and forth, right?
Oh, yeah. It gets quite pointed.
Dr. Leland pushes back directly on just focusing on spiritual change. She says something like, transformation begins with resistance to injustice. How can you love your neighbor while remaining silent in the face of oppression?
Wow. Drawing a direct line between love, justice, and action.
Yeah. She's implying passive spirituality isn't enough when people are actually suffering.
And Matthew's response.
Equally firm. He counters, Jesus didn't preach revolution. He preached redemption. He didn't lead armies or draft laws. He touched lepers, forgave prostitutes, and washed feet.
Grounding it back in those specific acts.
Exactly. And then he adds, that's not political theater. That's divine humility. He's drawing a sharp line between those intimate, compassionate, individual acts and any kind of political strategy. For him, that radical love and humility, that's the true ethical core, way more potent than any political program.
That specific exchange really crystallizes the debate, doesn't it? And it raises a really critical question for all of us, I think. Is there some fundamental, maybe irreconcilable conflict between advocating for social justice, you're trying to change systems, and focusing on individual spiritual growth?
Or could they be connected?
Or can they actually be two sides of the same coin? Maybe one informs and fuels the other. Could it be that the political and the spiritual aren't these totally separate boxes, but are actually deeply intertwined, influencing each other in ways we don't always expect?
That's something to really chew on. Now, what about the broader academic angles they brought in?
Right, moving beyond just the ethical. Dr. Leland brings in sort of an anthropological or sociological perspective. She argues, pretty standard in historical studies, that every religious movement arises in a socio-political matrix.
Meaning you can't understand it in isolation.
Exactly. You can't fully grasp a faith, its teachings, its impact, if you divorce it from the culture, the power dynamics, the social norms it grew out of. She argues that stripping Jesus' teachings of that historical context makes them lose coherence. Yeah, and she mentions that from a modern historical scholarship viewpoint, he's increasingly seen as an apocalyptic prophet with political resonance, especially among oppressed Jewish groups.
Placing him firmly back into those historical currents.
Yes, acknowledging that his message, even if spiritual at its core, would have inevitably been heard and interpreted through the lens of political liberation by many people listening to him then.
Okay. And Reverend Matthews is counter to that academic view.
He offers a strong theological rebuttal. He states, quite pointedly, that theology is not reducible to anthropology.
Meaning faith is more than just culture.
Precisely. He says faith is not a cultural artifact, it's a divine encounter. He's arguing that while, sure, cultural context matters, it provides the setting, it doesn't fully explain or contain the divine transcendent nature of Jesus, his message, his origin.
There's something more going on than just sociology.
That's his position.
Yeah.
A spiritual reality that goes beyond just human cultural phenomena. And he also points out that Jesus often defied cultural norms rather than aligning with political ideologies.
He wasn't just reflecting his time.
No, he was actively challenging its conventions, breaking its rules, often in ways that didn't fit neatly into any existing political camp. In doing so, Matthews would argue from a position of divine authority, not just human reasoning or cultural adaptation.
Okay. And they seem to circle back to those defiant acts again here.
They do. Dr. Leland argues that things like talking to Samaritans, dining with tax collectors, actions that shattered rigid social and religious rules back then were inherently political.
Because they challenged the social order.
Yes. For her, these weren't just random acts of niceness, they were subversive. They undermined the established hierarchies that kept society structured, often benefiting those in power. They were disruptions with political implications.
And Matthew's take on those same acts.
Consistent with his overall view, he argues Jesus broke those boundaries to reveal God's love, not to start a movement. Again, the focus is on the underlying spiritual motive versus a conscious political strategy.
Revealing God's character, not reforming society directly.
Exactly. For him, those boundary-breaking acts showed radical inclusion, radical compassion as reflections of God's nature itself, not as calculated steps in some plan for social or political change.
Man. So what does this all mean for us, trying to make sense of this incredibly profound and clearly complex historical figure?
Well, it means we're definitely dealing with multiple layers of interpretation, don't you think? Each layer is built on the same foundational stories, the same events, the same words, but they yield dramatically different understandings of his purpose, his legacy, his impact.
Yeah, no easy answers here.
Definitely not. But as we try to synthesize this, to bring it together, we can actually look at some insights from Dr. Evelyn Clark. She's a renowned religious studies scholar who was apparently cited in the original debate materials.
Okay, what does she offer?
She seems to capture the essence of this complex discussion really well. She acknowledges that both perspectives, the historians and the pastors, are deeply rooted in their respective frameworks. It's not about saying one is simply right and the other is simply wrong. It's about appreciating the valid points within each way of thinking, recognizing their strengths.
Seeing the value in both lenses.
Exactly. She states very clearly that, historically, we cannot deny that Jesus' words and actions carried political implications, especially within the context of Roman-occupied Judea. That's the historical reality Dr. Leland hammered home so effectively.
The context mattered immensely.
Immensely. The setting, the charged language, the manner of his death, all of it had political weight then and there. However, Dr. Clark also affirms that it's also true that Jesus intentionally avoided aligning with any political faction of his time.
Which supports Reverend Matthews' point.
Strongly. It backs up the argument that he wasn't a zealot, wasn't a conventional revolutionary, wasn't playing partisan politics in the earthly sense. He deliberately stepped away from those roles.
Okay, so both things can be true.
That seems to be the core insight here, the real aha moment that Dr. Clark points to. She concludes that tension between radical social impact and spiritual transcendence is what keeps the debate alive to this day.
The tension itself is the key.
That's the idea. The power of this discussion isn't really in picking a side and declaring victory. It's in understanding and maybe even holding that dynamic tension, recognizing that, yeah, his message had undeniable social and political consequences, often hugely disruptive ones, even if his primary focus was on spiritual transformation and a kingdom not of this world.
That duality.
Exactly. That inherent duality is precisely what makes his legacy so complex, so enduring, and frankly, so relevant across completely different times and places for 2,000 years. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the deep understanding isn't in choosing A or B, but in appreciating this ongoing dynamic tension between them.
That really does pull it together nicely, and it's so clear this isn't just some abstract historical puzzle, right? It really resonates with people today. It affects how they see their own faith, how they engage with the world.
For sure.
We actually got a glimpse of that from a couple of audience members who were at the original debate. Their reflections really capture this tension and how it lands differently for different people.
Oh, interesting. What did they say?
Well, one person shared something like, "I always thought of Jesus as just a teacher of peace. But after hearing Dr. Leland, I'm realizing peace often comes through resistance to injustice. Maybe," they said, "maybe being political doesn't have to mean being partisan."
That's a common realization, isn't it? Redefining political.
Yeah, that it can be broader than just party politics. It can mean a commitment to justice, to challenging oppression, inspired by his example. And then another audience member offered a different take, equally valid. They said, "I'm with Reverend Matthews. Jesus was different because he didn't play by the political rules. He spoke to people's souls, not their ballots."
Connecting with that transcendent individual focus.
Exactly. This person really connected with the idea that Jesus' impact went beyond earthly power structures, focusing on that deeper internal change that transforms the world from the inside out.
Wow. It really shows how these ideas ripple out.
It does. It shows these conversations don't just end when the debate is over. They continue outward, influencing how each of us understands our own beliefs and how we choose to engage with the world around us. So as you can hear, we've really immersed ourselves in these rich, pretty complex sources from that great debate series. We've explored how a brilliant historian and a respected pastor, looking at the very same history, the same texts, can reach such profoundly different yet equally compelling conclusions about Jesus' political nature.
Quite the journey.
It really has been. Hopefully you now have a more nuanced, a more deeply informed understanding of a question that's puzzled people for centuries. A question that honestly continues to shape how we think about faith, about power, about justice, right here, right now. We really hope this deep dive gave you some of those aha moments, maybe offered a bit of a shortcut to feeling well-informed without getting totally buried in all the details.
And as you sit with all this, as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, maybe consider this question for yourself. Can spiritual teachings, truly spiritual teachings, ever be completely free from having a political impact in the real world?
Ooh, good one.
And then, how does your answer to that question maybe shape how you understand your own role, your actions, your responsibilities in the world that you live in? It's definitely something to keep pondering long after we finish talking here.
Absolutely. A great takeaway question. And look, if you're fired up and want to dig even deeper into this specific topic, we can definitely recommend some of the excellent books that were mentioned or referenced in the debate materials.
Where should people start?
Well, you could check out Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth by Reza Aslan, or a classic, Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. There's also Render to Caesar, Jesus, the Early Church, and the Roman Superpower by Christopher Bryan.
Good recommendations.
And of course, if you want the full argument straight from the sources we discussed, you could seek out the works of the original debaters themselves, Dr. Margaret Leland's The Nazarene and the Empire, and Reverend Paul Matthews' The Kingdom Not of This World. Fantastic resources if you want to continue exploring these really vital questions on your own.
Lots to dig into there.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope you'll join us next time. We're going to be tackling another truly fascinating question from the Great Debate series, this one featuring a leading literary critic versus a seminary theologian.
Oh, what's the topic?
The question is, was the Bible written by men or inspired by God?
Wow. Another small one.
Yeah, just a light topic. It promises to be another really engaging head-to-head discussion. So until then, keep asking the big questions and keep that curiosity alive.